till the numbers go up to start for a few minutes. Oh, wait, Mai's gonna
Yeah,
start.
I'll open us up.
Okay.
Just some brief comments.
Those numbers are going up.
Dang, it's fast.
Can people hear us now?
Yes.
Perfect.
All right, we're just waiting until all the attendees join us in our room. Let's see here. Great. Wonderful. Let's go ahead and get started. It is 11 o'clock, 11:01 actually. Welcome to the third and final day of the 2020 MURAP conference. I hope you found the first 2 days to be as stimulating and as enriching as I have. You know, we've heard some amazing speakers, including the fabulous Monet Marshall, founder of the Moja Performing Arts Company, and also our very cerebral Melinda Lowry, professor of history here at UNC. And we've had so many great panelists, right? I can't even list all of them, but you know, the one on self-care has really, all weekend, you know, I can't watch a self-care ad without dissecting it and thinking about capitalism and how we use that word, right? And today, I'm sure, will be no different. We have two upcoming panels. One is our final MURAP Scholar panel, which we are all very excited about. And then we have an afternoon panel. It's the 2 p.m. MURAP Alumni Reunion. And I encourage everybody to join that session, even faculty mentors, if you're thinking, oh no, this is supposed to be for students. It really is an opportunity for you to hear about how MURAP has shaped the careers and lives of our MURAP alums. I think that might be instructional and maybe some informative for the way in which you mentor in the program. And I think that it'll just be fun to see how successful our MURAP alums are, really. They're doing such great things, and we have a few panelists that are really going to talk about their journey. But really, it's going to be, we're going to open it up to the rest of the audience, and it'll be gallery style. Unlike this webinar, you'll actually get to see everybody on that Zoom call. So make sure that you've brushed your hair and turn on your camera because everybody's going to be able to see one another. So I look forward to that session in the afternoon, and that'll be our last session to wrap up the MURAP conference. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Silva, who will be moderating our first session today.
Unmuting myself here. Welcome everybody. I am so excited to be moderating this panel with three amazing scholars who are joining the other amazing scholars who presented so far, not just at the conference, but also at our Tuesday seminars. What I'll do is I'll introduce everybody, and then each person will present, and then we'll take questions and have a really interesting Q&A. Our first presenter will be Eden Malaise. Eden is a senior at Lipscomb University, majoring in political science with a double minor in history and religion. As an International Scholars Fellow, she partook in research measuring educational inequities among traditionally marginalized groups in South Africa. She has also participated in constructing a community profile for a Department of Justice funded grant that helped develop a community-based diversion court in one of the most highly incarcerated zip codes in the country. Her experiences as an Eritrean American woman have served as a basis for her passion and interest in global affairs and the intersection of race, identity, and politics. Eden's scholarship in global affairs has earned her 2 awards from the World Affairs Council of America and recognition from the Tennessee World Affairs Council. In MURAP, her growth as a scholar and a researcher has been strengthened and refined under the mentorship of Dr. Isaac Una. Eden's project this summer seeks to create predictive models that better understand the display the relationship between nonprofits and government funding, specifically in the realm of international development work. After graduation, Eden plans to complete a PhD in political science with a concentration in race, ethnicity, and politics. Our next presenter will be Vicki Lee. Vicki is a rising senior at CUNY Hunter College, majoring in English with a concentration in linguistics and rhetoric and double minoring in Asian American studies and Japanese language. Vicki is a scholar in the Ronald E. McNair Postbaccalaureate Achievement Program and an inductee into Phi Beta Kappa. Alongside academic pursuits, Vicki is also leading Hunter's chapter of Sigma Tau Delta, the International English Honor Society, as president, and is vice president of Hunter's Japanese Club. Through MURAP, she's currently developing her research interests in sociolinguistics with a focus in Asian American populations. Under the guidance of Dr. Lema A. Graham, she's investigating the influence of language surrounding COVID-19 on social perceptions of the Asian community and determination of social groups within Asian Americans. She hopes to continue her journey into graduate school and professional duties with the aim of contributing to a more representative face of academia and spreading understanding of ethnic variants of English through academic studies. And last but not least, we have Brian Taylor, who is a first-generation McNair scholar and holds an A in English from Diablo Valley College. He's currently pursuing a BA in Humanities and Communications with an emphasis in creative writing and social action from California State University in Monterey Bay. From collecting oral histories and querying archival records to writing poetry, narrating his research experiences, Brian's interests are ever-changing. However, one thing can be certain, sharing his story and the stories of those within his communities will always be at the core of his research. Under the guidance of Dr. Ariana Vihol, Brian's MURAP research project investigates how anti-shelter-in-place protesters perform white supremacy. In the future, he plans to pursue his PhD in American Studies to analyze how the past haunts the present and influences contemporary race relations, while also focusing on intersections of gender, class, and queerness. I am so excited and I am looking forward to all these amazing presentations. So Eden, you can get us started.
Hi everyone, my name is Eden Mellis and I'm a senior at Lipscomb University. Under the guidance of Dr. Isaac Una, I've had the wonderful opportunity to pursue my research project this summer that is entitled, Does Size Really Matter? Explaining the Determinants of Nonprofit Organization Success and Receiving Government Grants. I'm really excited to share with you all the results of my research at this year's MURAP conference. Before I get started, I'd like to provide you all with a brief overview of my presentation. First, I'll begin by defining some key terms that will then lead me to presenting my research questions. I'll then give an overview of my theoretical frameworks before getting into my hypotheses and methodology. Lastly, I'll present you all with my findings and conclude by offering some next steps and possible future directions of this research. For the purpose of this study, I'd like to take some time to define some terms that are essential to this project. These terms may initially seem pretty self-explanatory, but it's very important to note that no legal definition of the terms non-governmental organization or faith-based organization exists. I've presented the definition of nonprofits as a reference to contrast these other two terms that are often conflated for one another. An NGO can be categorized as an organization that operates freely from the government and, like nonprofits, rely on donations and grants to fund their services. While they operate without governmental administration, they may receive funding from the government and tend to work internationally. NGOs largely differ from nonprofits in that they have no government affiliation and no government members. Many scholars continue to debate the definition of what it means to be a faith-based organization, and because of this, no complete list of these organizations exists. I think it's important to note the presence of FBOs in this study, as they comprise the majority of organizations involved in international development work. For the purpose of this presentation, I will define FBOs as a non-state actor that have central religious or faith core to their philosophy, membership, or programmatic approach, although they are simply not missionaries. While it is known that philanthropic organizations have long provided services to underserved communities domestically and abroad, what sets these organizations apart from one another is the way that they're able to foster relationships with the populations they serve and the way that they deliver their services. With over 1.5 million nonprofits in the United States, it can sometimes be hard to distinguish this for ourselves. Lynn and Wiley have classified most charitable organizations as functioning from these four traditions of philanthropy. Philanthropy as relief can be thought of as serving an immediate need. Philanthropy as improvement can be thought of these organizations that teach people how to improve their current situation. Philanthropy as social reform can be understood as organizations that strive to address structural inequities that create hardships. Lastly, the tradition of civic engagement can be seen in organizations that encourage community participation through shared interests. These scholars note that these multiple approaches are not mutually exclusive, and an organization can function from one or multiple of them. However, when it comes to seeking funding, organizations that operate with the mission of challenging the status quo may run into more issues. For instance, Insight, an organization that defines itself as, quote, a network of radical feminists of color organizing to end state violence and violence in our homes and communities, end quote, operate mainly from the traditions of civic engagement and social reform. In their anthology, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex, the organization offers their account of how they had received a grant from the Ford Foundation for $100,000 that they had committed to 2 new projects. Months later, they were informed that their grant had been revoked due to a statement the organization had put out that demonstrated their solidarity with the Palestinian liberation movement. This circumstance illustrates clearly that although some nonprofits operate in ways they best see fit to achieving their goals, their progress can be tied to their ability to receive funding. Primarily, nonprofits rely on funding that comes from the government, private donors, or voluntary donations. In this study, I intend to explore the questions of what kinds of nonprofits engaging in international development work have relationships with government funding, and what kinds of organizations receive funding. My analysis relies on 2 main theories, the principal agent theory and the resource dependence theory. The principal agent theory can be understood as a contract under which one or more persons, the principal, engages another person, the agent, to perform some service on their behalf, which involves delegating some decision-making authority to the agent. In this case, the principal actor would be the federal government, and the agent would be nonprofit organizations. The government delegates the responsibility of providing foreign assistance to other countries to NGOs through grants and contracts to supplement government initiatives. Due to the reliance on NGOs to provide these services, some scholars have argued that funding sources can create a marketization of funds that causes these organizations to compete with one another for funding and can lead to things like poor project implementation. The principal-agent relationship may also work to diminish the autonomy of these organizations by causing them to alter their agendas and pursue interests that align more with U.S. foreign policy in order to secure funding. For example, during the Cold War, the federal government did not fund NGOs that worked in certain countries. The resource dependence theory articulates the idea that organizations are made up of coalitions that are formed to influence and control behavior. The environment they operate in contains resources that are essential, but scarce, which leads these organizations to try and acquire as much control over these resources as possible to make themselves independent. The implications of this theory can most clearly be seen in nonprofit behavior and their composition. Other scholars have used this framework to examine nonprofit boards and executives to identify patterns that may provide a clearer association between leadership and access to resources. For example, a study of 95 nonprofits in the US found that the more government funding an organization received, the less the nonprofit board reflected the community it served. A similar study based in Uganda also found that what predicted the success of NGOs receiving private funds more than anything was the connectedness of the NGO executives. While my study does not examine nonprofit management, the resource dependence theory is essential in providing an insight into what may influence organizations to apply for funding and subsequently receive it. Now I'd like to shift to examining the role of US nonprofits and NGOs abroad. The US provides foreign aid to countries in various ways, including relying on charitable organizations. This image displays the foreign aid distribution from fiscal year 2018 from federal agencies. Although this image only accounts for military and economic assistance, according to the Congressional Research Report on Foreign Aid for this fiscal year, the U.S. Agency for International Development outspends other agencies with a total of $20 billion in aid across various assistance categories. The majority of foreign aid is sent to Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa and the Middle East, and South and Central Asia. A benefit of using NGOs and nonprofits to deliver this aid is that it allows the government to fund organizations with niche focuses that serve populations of people who may be averse to forming relationships with government providers. However, the perceptions of US NGOs and nonprofits abroad cannot always be separated from the actions of the US government. One of the most notable examples of this is the CIA's use of fake vaccination clinics. In 2011, the CIA set up a fake vaccination clinic in Pakistan in an effort to infiltrate the compound that the bin Laden family had been suspected of living in. The goal of this effort was to collect DNA samples from those living in the compound to confirm their identity before attacking it. Although this was solely an operation of the CIA, it fueled a lot of pre-existing rumors that circulated around Western NGOs. Primarily, the mission undercut the credibility of NGOs that provide these critical healthcare services. The disease polio spreads naturally in Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, all places where rumors of vaccination clinics being Western plots to sterilize women, Muslims, and introduce new diseases to these places are running rampant. As a result of the US's actions, legitimate NGOs and nonprofits have been expelled from these countries, which has subsequently led to deaths of thousands of people that could have been prevented by access to these critical vaccines. A separate analysis that was conducted using the same data set that I will be using indicates that for some organizations, perception of government interference in their organization may actually lead them to not apply for funding. Conversely, this study really aims to look at what organizational characteristics may cause an organization to embrace the idea of forming a financial relationship with the US government. Using the resource dependence theory as the basis, I hypothesize that larger organizations are more likely to apply for funding and receive funding. Another study conducted with this data set affirmed the finding of other scholars that there are no major differences in size between faith-based and secular organizations. I also hypothesize that organizations that focus in areas that align with US foreign policy are more likely to apply for funding and receive funding. I believe that there is a link between the US government funding organizations that will complement their soft power initiatives globally and promote a more altruistic view of the United States while simultaneously delivering these services. The data analyzed in this study was initially collected via an online survey that was sent to nonprofits that indicated on their IRS 990 form that they work in international affairs. To make sure that organizations that were solely domestically were excluded from the responses, the first survey questions served to weed out those that indicated that they did not provide direct services abroad. The surveys were sent to a random sample of 2,271 organizations. 405 responded, but only 351 responses were usable for analysis, which brought the adjusted response rate to 16%. I then coded the survey responses and put them into SPSS, where I used binary logistic regression to estimate my two models. Binary logistic regression analyzes the association between variables that account for two possible outcomes. In this case, the two outcomes for my first model were applying for a grant or not applying for a grant. And for my second model, it was receiving a grant or not receiving a grant. Here I've displayed some descriptive statistics about my sample. There are 405 organizations, with about 134 being faith-based and 154 being secular. The graph on the right indicates the total spread of religious affiliation of all of the organizations that responded to this question. The top individual focus areas of these organizations were education, health, and children's issues. The two boxes on this slide represent the total amount of organizations that have applied for funding and those that have also received funding. The two dependent variables I will be measuring in this analysis are organizations applying for government grants and organizations receiving government grants. The two models I have created use the same 6 independent variables, which are divided into 2 categories: those that measure size and those that measure organizational focus. To measure organizational size, I've used a variable that measures the number of countries an organization works in, which will further be displayed on my graphs as international presence, the range of organizations' annual expenditures, and the number of paid employees. To measure organizational focus, I've created 3 categories that align with U.S. foreign policy that encompass multiple sub-focuses an organization may also work in. The initial survey had 14 different categories in which an organization could indicate or areas it worked in. The majority of organizations identified themselves as working from multiple areas of focus. Due to this, I decided to create these 3 categories that reflect foreign policy and foreign aid distribution categories. I first ran a correlation analysis with all of the individual focuses and then grouped those that correlated highly with one another and those that were statistically significant together. Then I conducted a reliability analysis to formulate these 3 categories and see which focuses were best grouped together. The Cronbach's alpha for each category tells us how well these items hang together, and as you can see, all of the scores are above 50%. Here, I just wanted to provide you all with a reminder of what my hypotheses were before I jump into my data analysis. So again, I hypothesized that larger organizations are more likely to apply and receive funding, and that organizations that focus in areas that align with U.S. foreign policy are more likely to apply and receive funding. So these graphs are visual representations of my regression models. If you'll focus on the one on the left first, you'll see that these are the results of my first model, where the dependent variable is measuring organizations applying for grants. The circular dots represent the estimate for my regression result, which indicates the impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable. The horizontal line, which looks like a cat whisker, represents the confidence interval. So if the whisker line crosses the vertical red line, that variable is statistically insignificant. As you can see in this graph, 5 of my 6 variables are statistically significant, meaning they are important in explaining the behavior of organizations surrounding grants. For 3 variables, the effect is positive and negative for 1. If you'll now look at the graph on the right, it can be read the same way, but this one represents my model, which is concerned with organizations receiving grants. The 4 variables here that are statistically significant differ in that the number of paid employees is now statistically insignificant. This graph is a margins plot of my first model that measures the likelihood of organizations applying for a grant. These graphs provide a more in-depth look at how each individual variable affects an organization's likelihood of applying for a grant. Remember that the top 3 graphs represent the measures of organizational size, and the bottom 3 represent the measures of organizational focus. As you can see, the greater annual expenditures an organization has, the higher the probability of them applying for a grant. The same can be said for the number of paid employees and international presence. The more countries an organization works in, the increased likelihood of them applying for a grant. And the greater number of paid employees an organization has, the increased probability they will also apply for a grant. These graphs demonstrate how larger organizations have a size advantage that allows them to utilize their resources to not only do more work, but employ specialized workers. The significance of these variables support my hypotheses that larger organizations are more likely to apply for funding. The bottom three graphs represent organizational focus. The x-axis on these graphs are based on an additive scale, which essentially measures an organization's true focus on each category. For example, the peace and security graph indicates that the more an organization's focus is on peace and security, the greater the probability that the organization will apply for a grant. The variable economic growth and empowerment, however, is negative. This result shows that the more an organization is focused on economic growth and empowerment, the less likely they are to apply for a government grant. This result initially seemed kind of counterintuitive, especially since economic growth is the third highest category of foreign aid. However, I believe that this result may possibly be attributed to the vast funding opportunities made available by corporations, private foundations, and international bodies such as the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and the UN, causing these organizations to not seek government funding. As you can see, the result for democracy and human rights is flat, which indicates that there is no impact on this variable in grant application. These graphs are the margins plot for my second model that measures grant success. These results here mimic the results of the previous graph, with all of the same variables being statistically significant and insignificant, with the exception of paid employees, which is now statistically insignificant. What my results indicate is that when it comes to grant success, organizations that have higher amounts of annual expenditures are more likely to receive grants. Organizations that have large international presence are more likely to receive funding when they apply. These two variables seem to indicate that large organizations operate similarly to what the resource dependence theory states and displays the size advantage that allows these organizations to have increased capacity to access more resources. We can see that organizations with strong focuses on peace and security are more likely to successfully receive funding, which is expected as peace and security is the foreign aid program with the most funding behind it. I also believe that the result for economic growth and empowerment to be the same for the reasons I previously mentioned. So to conclude, the results of my two models seem to support the hypotheses that I have proposed, although the variable for number of paid employees in democracy and human rights were both statistically insignificant. I believe that going forward, introducing some variables to measure size and introducing more variables to measure size and organizational focus could assist in producing a more precise result that accounts for more of the organizational nuances. Some next steps of this project could definitely also include analyzing the level of political engagement of these organizations and the makeup of their executive boards to see in what ways the impacts of their attitudes towards funding change. Though overall, I see interviews with these organizations to detail their specific experience as an essential way to gain a more comprehensive understanding of their relationship towards government funding. It is also important to note that while a lot of nonprofits and NGOs rely on government grants, not every organization has trouble securing donations from private donors. I would also just be curious to see if organizations that focus on economic growth fall into this category, or if the US government does not wish to additionally fund these organizations for fear of creating competition globally. So I'd like to thank all of you for watching my presentation. I'd like to thank my advisor from my university, Dr. Haynes, for allowing me to use this data set she compiled to complete this project and for all of her assistance. I'd also like to thank my mentor, Dr. Una, for his guidance and mentorship through every stage of this project. I would truly not have been able to complete this without him. I'd like to thank Leanne, Jen, Giovanni, and the rest of the MURAP staff for all of their feedback and patience, as well as my cohort members for their continual support and peer mentorship. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of the MURAP faculty and the program as a whole for making all of this possible. I really look forward to hearing all of your questions and comments during the Q&A. And if you have any questions that I don't get to answer, please feel free to take down my email.
Eden, maybe the last part of the video got cut off with your email address, and I'm wondering if you would like to put that in chat so that if people do have questions, and that was an amazing presentation, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions, but comments and observations that people have. So if you could share that over chat, that would be great. And thank you. Next, we have Vicky Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Silva. Let me just share my screen. So good morning to our MURAP community and all of our esteemed guests, and I'm honored to be presenting for you today. So today I'd like to talk about the race talk on Reddit and China virus and its effect on Asian Americans, where I discuss the various naming of COVID-19 and its effect on the Asian American community and how they determine their social groups by looking through posts on Reddit. So before we begin, I'd like to go over some major events from the past year, beginning with January 20th, where the first case of COVID-19 enters the US and brings the country into mounting panic. And because said case was from a returnee of Wuhan, China, soon after, locals began applying certain names like the Wuhan virus or the China virus, and along with various rumors of the bat soup and wild animal trade, there was spiking fear of Asian Americans and the Chinese that entered the country. Soon after, in response, the World Health Organization, or WHO, releases a statement on February 11th of 2020, renaming the virus to the coronavirus and then eventually COVID-19 pandemic. And Asian American community leaders also went out to protest against the cases of hate crimes against Asian Americans during the pandemic. However, despite these best efforts, on March 16th, 2020, Donald Trump releases this tweet, which brings a full swing of xenophobia, or fear of a specific race. Because certain framing names were being pushed by the US administration and advocated for by the president, the more neutral terms that WHO gave were replaced by ethnically framing names that pointed to a specific ethnicity as the perceived source of the pandemic. So such names, such as the Chinese virus, define the social groups of the we of Americans and the them of the Chinese. However, such names that frame a certain ethnicity in times of widespread disease that lead to racism isn't the first case with COVID-19. With cases of pandemics throughout history, such as the Spanish flu of 1918, where past literature established how naming that frames a certain ethnicity eventually leads to xenophobic behavior and fear. So many studies for the Spanish flu pandemic focused on media framing, which found that early coverage in the media typically begins to focus on the threat of contagion and warning people to caution to the threat of contagion. But gradually, throughout the swing of the pandemic, media reporting transitioned into reassuring the public by associating the pandemic with foreigners or a foreign country to try and tell people that the threat will be contained. In the case of the Spanish flu pandemic, this resulted in fear and criticism of the Spanish, even though the theorized origin of the disease was not in Spain. So gradually moving into a more modern timeline, there was also the Ebola virus disease pandemic in 2014, that though the name doesn't refer to a specific ethnicity, it does reference a theorized location of origin, which was in the Democratic Republic of Congo, linking perceptions of the disease to images of Africa. In the US at the time, this resulted in criticism and scrutiny over the Black community. And because of its time period, many of the studies for the pandemic focused on using social media, like Twitter, Instagram, and Flickr. The Twitter studies mostly presented positive comments, such as prayers and cautions against certain threats, but had a shortcoming of a word limit. The studies for Instagram and Flickr used the photos that people were posting throughout their social media platforms to grab a perception of what they thought about the pandemic, which also yielded pretty positive reactions. However, between these two pandemics, there is another case that aligns more directly with the current COVID-19 crisis. which was the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, or SARS pandemic of 2003. Because of its perceived origins, which were bats in Yunnan. And if you recall from the beginning, the rumors of bat soup was really caused the beginning xenophobic reactions in the case of COVID-19. So for studies in SARS at the time, Asian stereotypes of exotic food culture and Asians being perpetual foreigners that do not belong in America were at its high. And many studies at the time that reviewed SARS interviewed Asian Americans actually in Chinatown of New York City, which showed that Asian Americans themselves also propagated these stereotypes against Chinese immigrants and mainland Chinese people, portraying them as people who are, quote unquote, taking out the dirtiness of Chinese and entering into the US with them. This brings me to my research question, which is how do Asian Americans, as a mix of the we that Trump identifies and the other of the Asian population, interpret and digest COVID-19's incriminating terms? And do they, as with the SARS studies, perceive a sense of aversion towards those who are more closely aligned to a perceived source of the pandemic, such as Chinese Americans, immigrant Chinese, or mainland Chinese? So when approaching this question, I'd like you to recall the methods for the Ebola studies of turning to social media. Currently, the rise of social media is on its high, where many people are moving to their social media platforms to speak about their experiences during the pandemic. Especially the Asian American community is looking towards the internet to express their experiences of racism. In this study, I look at the Asian American subreddit. First, because of its anonymity that allows for honest opinions that are not connected to a specific identity. And also for its lack of a text restriction, unlike the Ebola studies on Twitter that had a shortcoming of having a word limit, the Reddit posts allow for longer responses and more fleshed out thoughts. And also its moderators, who work to maintain the authenticity of the group as an Asian American community. So in the interest of posts that have longer responses, I'm also taking this data into a linguistic turn with the theory of implicature, which is the hidden meaning behind words beyond their literal interpretations. So the theory of implicature is split into two main subsets. First, which is conventional implicature, which is the literal meaning behind the words, and conversational implicature, which is the implied meaning behind a speaker's words based on the context of the situation. So in this example, we have this statement, which would be our conventional implicature, or the literal meaning of the words, which is Jones dresses well and writes grammatical English. But because of this context, that the statement was part of a recommendation letter for a philosophy position, one can deduce a conversational implicature, or an underlining meaning that Jones is not very good at philosophy, because the statement that was part of the recommendation letter for a philosophy position doesn't include any qualities that can apply for philosophy. Along with this theory, I'd like to move on to the methods, where I use the Reddit Application Programming Interface, or API, and Python to take the top 10 posts from 4 keyword searches: China, Chinese, Wuhan, and virus. After gathering these posts, I choose related posts to my topic with a qualitative method, and I perform discourse analyses on the posts and comments that were chosen, where I basically explore the meaning and context behind the language. So here are some Reddit key concepts that are necessary to understanding the system of Reddit. This is an example post that will actually be mentioned later on. This is the score, which is basically the number of upvotes minus the number of downvotes. The rank on the keyword searches will be based on the number of upvotes. This is the upvote percentage. The upvote and downvote system is similar to the like and unlike of Facebook, which is basically a feature where users agree or disagree with the post. Comments with negative scores, where the downvotes are greater than the number of upvotes, are hidden. Posts that were repeated between keyword searches will be counted in the keyword search where the post ranked the highest. And posts without comments are omitted. So throughout the keyword searches, there were 4 common themes that appeared. First is China's exotic food culture, reactions to Donald Trump's rhetoric, anti-China or Communist Party of China, CCP sentiments, and addressing the name directly. In the interest of time, I'll be addressing the first 3 themes in my results and analysis, beginning with the first theme, which is China's exotic food culture. So the results will be split into 2 basic categories of criticism and defense, where I choose one comment that presents a criticism against ethnicities of Asia or certain Chinese people. And I'll also pick a comment that presents an opposing opinion in defense of those groups. So beginning with the criticism. Let's look at this post that has a score of 266 and a 89% upvote that ranked over 9th in the keyword search for China. This post was basically about Bill Mayer defending the usage of an incriminating term, Chinese virus, because of perceived origins in Chinese food culture, where he links the naming of a pandemic to Chinese culture itself. And in response, there was a hidden comment that had negative 11 points, which presents a case of a member of this Asian American subreddit propagating Asian food stereotypes. And in its conversational implicature, or underlying meaning, the use of the Chinese in the comment establishes difference between the user themselves and the ethnicity, defining mainland Chinese as an outside social group that does not belong with the social group the user identifies with. Moving into the defense. This post that had a score of 50 and 88% upvote and ranked number 8th in the keyword search for Wuhan was basically about a Times article that refuted the stereotypes of linking wild food culture to the pandemic. And in response, this comment that had 21 points was actually a tweet that the user takes as a representation of their own opinions and perspectives. And the tweet begins with a recognition of how the virus advances Asian stereotypes of dirtiness, which then leads to racism. There's a conventional implicature or literal meaning in advocating for support of the victims and criticizing xenophobic attitudes, when the user says that the Wuhan coronavirus should have generated sympathy for the victims. But if you look closely at the phrasing, the phrase the Wuhan coronavirus also has a hidden conversational implicature in its words that replicates divisive language and speaks to perceptions of separation between the user themselves and the them of the victims, despite intentions to be supporting the victims. So moving on to the next theme, which is reactions to Donald Trump's rhetoric, we'll also begin with a criticism. This post that had a score of 326 and a 98% upvote ranked number 9th in the keyword for virus. This post was a compilation of the different hate crimes that Asian Americans experienced after Trump persisted in using Chinese virus as a phrase in his social media and in public speeches. So one of the comments, that was a hidden comment with a whopping negative 48 points, begins with a conventional implicature or a direct meaning of differentiating between an enemy country and the we of America, by saying that this is America after all, and we are Americans first. By mentioning this line, the user paints Asian Americans as mainly minorities that should prioritize their identities as Americans before their ethnicities as Asians. And because there isn't any coded language where the conventional and conversational implicature are one and the same, and the user presents a direct statement of their perspectives, there was much attention for this post, where there are several people in the Asian American community disagreeing with the opinion. Moving into the defense, this post had a score of 199 and a 98% upvote ranks number 7th in the keyword search for China. So the post was basically about Trump attributing foreignness to Wei Jiazheng, who's a relatively famous Asian American reporter, by saying that an Asian reporter should ask China why people are dying of the coronavirus, where Trump refused to acknowledge Wei Jiazheng's American identity and dictates her as an Asian person. And Zhang also recognizes this when she replies, "Why are you saying that to me specifically?" Because Trump is linking her to a perceived foreign country of China, despite the fact that she also belongs to the social group of America. And in response, this comment that had 1 point presents a conventional implicature or a direct meaning or that defends Zhang as part of the us of Americans when the user says an American reporter shouldn't have to ask China why Americans are dying, showing that Zhang is, before her Asian identity, is an American reporter. However, this distinction of identifying her as American also presents a conversational implicature or a implied meaning that differentiates China from Americans, with the statement that those who live in the US are part of a fundamentally different social group from those who live in China at the moment. So comparing Chinese Americans and mainland Chinese as different groups that shouldn't have to communicate with each other to figure out the situation of America at the moment. This speaks to the separation that this user feels between the us of Americans and the them of China as different social groups, and placing the boundary of those social groups with this comment. So moving into the last theme, which is anti-China or Communist Party of China CCP sentiments. Still beginning with the criticism, with this post that had a score of 254 and a 97% upvote that ranked number 11th in the keyword for China. The post was about Houston Republican congressional candidate Kathleen Wall making her anti-Chinese platform the center of her campaign, with the headline that China poisoned our people. This comment that was hidden with -9 points presents a conventional implicature or literal meaning that attributes blame to China for the spread of the pandemic, saying that China did bring the plague. But in its next line of agreeing with the title that China poisoned our people, it also presents a conversational implicature or implied meaning that places difference between the them of mainland Chinese and the our people of Chinese Americans as fundamentally separate social groups. This user's defense of the usage of incriminating language shows a perceived truth about the outgroup of mainland Chinese people. So moving into the defense. This post that had a score of 520 and a 95% upvote ranked number 3 in the keyword China. And since the post itself has discourse where the user expresses their opinion, we will also be analyzing what the post says. So the user begins with explaining the rhetoric they've seen around the Reddit forums in the Asian American thread that serve as examples of how Asian Americans have direct antagonism towards China and have anti-Chinese sentiments themselves. There is a conversational implicature or implied meaning when the user mentions our side, which identifies the Asian American label as its own category and its own social group that does have roots in both China and American, but still serves as its solitary category that cannot be understood by those who are non-Asian American or those who are outside of the Asian American social group. And the comment we're looking at for this post is this hot or trending comment that had 247 points. So this comment presents a conventional implicature or direct literal meaning of accepting the existence and prevalence of a divide between Asian Americans and mainland Chinese. And the user does this by stating that the reality is that some of them, in this case would be Asian Americans, do hate the Chinese people. And then the user turns to the media by placing responsibility on the media for spreading anti-Chinese sentiments throughout the years in the US. And because of the points that this comment has accumulated, this perspective serves as a representation of what many members of the community agree with, whether it's agreeing that there is anti-Chinese sentiments throughout the Asian American community, or agreeing with those anti-Chinese sentiments themselves. The comment represents a popular opinion for the community. So moving into some concluding points. First of all, Asian Americans themselves really do internalize and propagate pandemic-related ethnic discrimination and its language, especially when it's in relation to ethnicities that are perceived as closer to the source of the pandemic, such as mainland Chinese or Chinese Americans, despite having shared Asian heritage. Many users present a dichotomy between the framed ethnic group of the Chinese and America, where users present their opinions as a basic split between China versus America. However, there are also users who presented Asian American as its own social group that does not align to either entirely the Chinese or Americans, and is an individual identity that cannot be understood by either groups. But before all of these separational opinions, throughout the keyword searches, there's an overarching mindset that racism against any Asian group induces danger to all Asians, coming to the conclusion that incriminating naming of COVID-19, such as the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus, are tools of xenophobia against a collective identity of Asians, which speaks to the power of language to not only induce and aggravate cases of racism, but also influence the boundaries of social groups. But also beyond the case of a crisis, of a pandemic, it speaks to the importance of being mindful and taking care in your own words and in language, and also being mindful of language's effect on your own perceptions and its effect on others. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky, for your presentation. There are so many thoughts and comments. I will save them until we are in the Q&A section. Our next speaker is Brian Taylor.
Hey everyone, I'm Bryant Taylor, and this summer I worked under the guidance of Dr. Ariana Vahil to create this research project I titled The Body Knows: Calling Out White Supremacy in the Age of COVID. This project has been such a transformative and eye-opening experience for me and served as both a creation of knowledge and a process of catharsis and healing. Without further ado, this is what I've been working on so far. In April 2020, conservative groups across the United States, consisting predominantly of white men and white women, came together to protest. And these protests were created to oppose public health procedures, i.e. sheltering in place, social distancing, wearing face masks, etc., that were put in place to slow the spread of coronavirus, or COVID-19. Photographs of these protests circulated all across social media and local and national news channels. And these photographs captured a variety of things. You had protesters surrounding themselves with US flags and red, white, and blue, and some were dressed in bulletproof vests and carrying assault rifles. Others stood shouting with signs that claimed these procedures were nothing more than an attempt to restrict freedom within the United States, that they were communist, and were often followed with a demand to receive a haircut, eat out at a restaurant, or continue the golf season. When I first saw these photographs, they haunted me. So much so that without even seeing them, their presence continued to linger in my body throughout the day through these emotions. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I began to journal about my feelings toward these photographs, and through journaling, I began to name what I was seeing. In these protests, I saw whiteness mobilizing to sacrifice people of color for the sake of their normalcy. From here, I recognized that there was this clear link between these protests and white supremacy. While white protesters were rallying for reopening, they ignored the costs of their goal. Because as communities of color continue to be more likely hospitalized and die from COVID, they'll also be more likely to be harmed by loosening public health restrictions too soon. The call to reopen prioritizes white happiness over the health of people of color, and it is resemblant to white nationalist sentiment of whiteness above all others. So in thinking about these protests as a sacrifice, I also saw them as a performance. And through this lens, I was able to develop this research question of how are shelter-in-place protesters performing white supremacy? So in thinking about these protests as a sacrifice, I also saw them as a performance. And through this lens, My theoretical framework for this project is a journey that begins with bell hooks' theory as liberatory practice. In her opening line, she writes, "I came to theory because I was hurting. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me." And I really resonated with her words. As someone relatively new to research, I've always shied away from theory as I could never see its personal applications. However, living in a pandemic and grappling with my emotional reaction to these protests and these photographs, I felt lost trying to make sense of the world. In the midst of this, I found engaging with a theoretical grounding as it enabled me to understand the current political climate in relation to my identities and allowed me to name what I saw and felt and attach it to a larger context. In short, without bell hooks, this work wouldn't have existed at all, and I want to acknowledge her as the foundation of this project. Building from there, my theoretical framework, though all connected, splits into two groups: theories about race and white supremacy, and theories around trauma in the body as a source of knowledge. Due to time, I will only be talking about theories around race and white supremacy. However, I do read a piece of creative work that stems from theories around the body and trauma that I share at the end of the presentation, and I would also be happy to take questions about those theories and what they meant to this project. In talking about race and the performance of white supremacy, I place two theories in conversation with each other: Imani Perry's theory that race is something that happens, and Kelly Oliver's theory of false witnessing. In Perry's book, More Beautiful and More Terrible: The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States, Perry writes, race is something that happens rather than something that is. Racism is dynamic. And so when I think of racism being dynamic, I think of it as something that can appear and reappear in known and unknown forms. And what I mean by known and unknown, I mean more taught and less taught. And this fluidity extends to white supremacy. And when we think of white supremacy as being something that's fluid, it enables further investigation into how it happens and lingers throughout the United States, and specific to this project, in the photographs of anti-shelter-in-place protests. Now, I argue that one way white supremacy is happening in these protests is through this constructed narrative of oppression that motivated mobilization. This narrative that compares sheltering in place and wearing face masks to slavery, and being serviced in restaurants and golf courses, nail salons, not having those things, to the restriction of human rights. And these narratives are what Kelly Oliver would call false witnessing, and white supremacist ideology is inherently that. Oliver describes false witnessing as the creation of a narrative that covers over one's responsibility for social injustice. And these narratives are created when one forgets or purposefully ignores their subject position in relation to people, history, and other intersections of identity. In addition, Oliver writes that false witnessing resembles a performance, with false witnesses acting out the falsity of their testimony even as they testify to its truth. By examining these protests as an act of false witnessing, photographs of these protests highlight how protesters are quote-unquote acting out and performing their narrative to uphold white supremacy. My theoretical framework for this project is a journey that... In doing my literature review, I focused on what scholars had to say about the characteristics of white supremacy and how it appears in social movements. Before I dive deeper into that, I want to define how I'm using and viewing white supremacy in this presentation. So I've already mentioned that white supremacy is dynamic and it lingers within the structures of the United States. It can reappear and appear in known and unknown forms. What I'd like to add is that it's also exploitative of and violent toward people of color, and often exposes us to a range of adverse impacts. When looking at the ways white supremacy happens, I focus on its appearance in social movements. And social movements are created to convey dissatisfaction within social political environments and operate as a platform to communicate that dissatisfaction. What binds social movements together is the mobilization under a common identity for the purpose of change. Now, for white supremacists, their common identity is their race, their whiteness, and they mobilize to maintain the social standings and the prestige that comes with that whiteness. They'll often hide their agenda within social movements by reframing the language of their quote-unquote perceived supremacy to ideas around respecting traditional norms, practices, cultures, and beliefs. And when this happens, it allows for white supremacists to operate under narratives that place themselves as the victims who are being hurt when structures attempting racial equity are implemented. Now, these narratives which victimize white supremacists are examples of white false witnessing because they cover over how their perceived supremacy and their whiteness prevents them from experiencing the adverse impacts they'll appropriate in their narrative to mobilize, but that communities of color actually face. And we see these narratives of victimization a lot throughout the anti-shelter-in-place protests, but we've also seen them in the past during desegregation of schools in the United States, the rollbacks of affirmative action policies in colleges and universities after white students appropriated the rhetoric of discrimination and claimed that they were quote unquote being reverse discriminated against, while also ignoring the years of discriminatory practice against students of color. And the English only movement, where white US citizens claimed that they would be losing their culture and their nation to immigrants if English wasn't the official language of the United States. In doing my literature, in tackling my research question, I decided to do a visual analysis of 7 anti-shelter-in-place photographs, specifically from protests in Michigan, Missouri, and California. And in this analysis, I was looking at how the elements, by elements I mean people, color, symbols, actions within the photographs were working separately and together to tell a story. And what I noticed was that there were 3 categories of performances that were working through these photos. And those were patriotism, the weaponization of language, and militarization. For the sake of time, I will only be discussing the first 2 of these performances, but will be happy to take any questions on the third. The first category is the performance of patriotism. I want to direct your attention to the use of red, white, and blue in the US flag in these 3 photographs. Can you count how many flags you see? What about how much of the colors you see? In this category, I analyze what stories these protesters want to tell by using these symbols and colors. And what I've noticed is that these protesters perform their patriotism by drawing on a racialized understanding of what it means to be a citizen of the United States. Now, patriotism is a deeply felt affective attachment to the nation or the degree of love for and pride in one's nation. And the use of the US flag in red, white, and blue allude to these protesters supporting the United States, supporting ideas the United States values like freedom. That's a big one that gets looped through these protests very often. But the flag and the colors are also being used to challenge state authority, specifically the shelter-in-place orders. So what these protesters are trying to do is create this narrative, this image that they are supportive of the United States, and they're trying to position themselves as a pro-US movement that is fighting to preserve the US value of freedom, essentially. Now, the colors and the flag work with the presence of whiteness in the photographs to enhance this message of US patriotism. Patriotism is racialized and allows white people to perform and use patriotism, specifically US patriotism, to their advantage in a way that people of color can't. And this is because the idea of the US citizen is still synonymous with whiteness. Now, did you notice how these colors and the flag surround the bodies in the photographs? Almost like armor or shield. They're either in the foreground or the background, but they're always there. The imagery of US patriotism in these photographs acts as a shield and sword for the white protesters. By positioning themselves as a pro-US movement, which can then be validated by the color of their skin and the colors that surround their bodies, they can then weaponize their patriotism against those who challenge their authority and logic behind their mobilization. As the protesters use their whiteness to solidify this narrative of being patriotic and fighting for freedom and US values, and effectively labeling themselves as pro-US, they've also othered those who disapprove and question their movement as anti or not American. This label, too, is racialized, because if to be a US citizen is to be white, who immediately becomes the opposition? Not only is this label racialized, but there is a history of violence enacted against those who are given that label. So by playing with this narrative of whiteness and who is and isn't a citizen, these protesters are making statements about whose lives matter, as well as creating this us versus them narrative. Now, this performance of patriotism is really deceitful and an example of false witnessing. Because again, looking at how this movement started with the goal to reopen for haircuts and to eat at restaurants, there's this disconnect between that and hey, this is a pro-US movement, we're fighting for freedom. But that disconnect is purposeful, and this performance is a distraction, which is why the colors, the flags, are so abundant throughout photographs of these protests. The second category is the weaponization of language. I would like you to direct your focus to the words on the protest signs in these images. What do they say? Are there any comparisons? Can you spot the references they make? In this category, I analyzed these words for their meaning and how they relate to the goals of these protesters. So in these photographs, we have signs that read, "Land of the obedient, home of the enslaved, and muzzles are for dogs and slaves, I am a free human being." The sign on the left is a play on the national anthem lyric, "Land of the free, home of the brave." And the sign on the right compares wearing a face mask to the iron mask worn by an African woman who was enslaved in Brazil by the name of Anastasia. And the iron mask was used to punish slaves and prevent them from eating, drinking, swallowing, and talking. Now, the next sentence proclaims that the holder of the sign is a free human being and makes this distinction between the protester and the slave. Both these signs infer that with the implementation of public health procedures to slow the spread of COVID, that those that follow are slaves. Both signs are also speaking to the US value and idea of freedom to justify their mobilization. This once again positions themselves as this pro-US movement who aren't just fighting for freedom now, but are fighting specifically against enslavement. They also position those who oppose them and those who are implementing these procedures as people who want to enslave them. So not only have they positioned themselves as being these victimized freedom fighters who oppose slavery, they've also positioned their opposition as anti-American and enslavers. What separates weaponizing language and performing patriotism is how this narrative of oppression is being constructed. And I think that by differentiating the two based on this is very important. While protesters in the prior category could weaponize their patriotism to position themselves as victims using their whiteness, in this category, the protesters are appropriating experience outside their racial subject position to characterize themselves as oppressed. Although they aren't explicitly making claims of experiencing racial discrimination, by drawing comparisons between wearing face masks and stay-at-home orders to slavery, a racialized event in United States history, they're relying on a racialized context to victimize themselves. So when protesters say home of the enslaved and muzzles are for dogs and slaves, there's this inability to examine their social position, and that's false witnessing. Because while they're able to present their experience as this overwhelming or totalizing extreme circumstance of violence, they're also ignoring the ways their whiteness protects them from how communities of color are currently experiencing the pandemic, and from how they will experience the pandemic and the dangers of that within an early reopening. So when asking myself, what does this all mean? I think it shows white supremacy is alive and well and it's still thriving today. Not that anyone needs to be convinced of that, I hope, but I think it's important to note that how white supremacy can appear can change, and it can be different, and it can be in a way that perhaps we haven't seen it before personally. And this isn't to say that white supremacy hasn't existed as the weaponization of language or the manipulation of narrative or the performance of patriotism to mask white nationalism, because it definitely has. But it's to say that white supremacy can flip its head and it can make people question whether or not what they're seeing is it, because it's not presenting itself as, you know, men wearing ghost costumes and wearing crosses. It's presenting itself through these performances and the manipulation of stories. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that COVID isn't going away anytime soon, and neither will these calls to reopen. And with keeping that in mind, these narratives that sheltering in place, wearing face masks are equal to slavery or to the loss of rights are really, really harmful, because people will run with these narratives and then they won't follow these health procedures that are put in place to protect the vulnerable populations and to protect people in our communities, people that we love, that we are close to. And that's very dangerous. Hey all, it's Brian in the physical form. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation so far. As I mentioned before, when talking about my theoretical framework section, this project and presentation came with a small piece of creative work that was inspired by theories that talked about the body being a source of knowledge, specifically Joy DeGroote's theory of post-traumatic slave syndrome, Gloria Anzadula's theory, and I can never pronounce this in Spanish correctly, but the translation in English is the faculty, and Clarissa Pinkola Estes' theory of the body being a multilingual being. And together these theories speak of the ways the body archives trauma, both generational and personal, as memories, feelings, senses, and through this, the body begins to develop this ability to see the unseen and sense danger before it happens as a means of survival. Now, how this pertains to this project is that when I first saw these photographs, as I mentioned in the beginning, I saw them as a sacrifice. But there was also these other feelings of being afraid, of overwhelmed, angry. And as I unpacked these feelings through these theoretical lenses, I began to realize that these emotions of fear, anger, being overwhelmed, they meant something. And it was my body's way of trying to tell me something. And in short, that something was a, hey, there's danger here. Something's lurking within these photographs that's trying to harm you. Pay attention. And it was because of that signal, it led me to investigate, well, what is it? What is it that my body's picking up on and seeing? And that aspect actually became this research project. But then there was this other piece of, well, okay, how can I validate my body as this source of knowledge that can read a room, that can read a photograph and know that there's something off due to generational and personal experiences that linger within me? And how can I talk about the many personal aspects and layers of doing this project in a way that pairs both my research, but is also authentic to me? And so I chose to do this through poetry and through writing this very small free write, because free writes are the best types of poetry to me, to address a question that my mentor from community college had asked me when this project was first, coming out and into development. And that was, what would you say to these photographs? What would you say to white supremacy if you had the chance? And so this is what I wrote to that. In 10 weeks, I will tell them I wrote about you, and I will tell them everything. I will tell them how evil you are, how blood stains your hands, and how death is your shadow. I will tell them of your deceit, how your eyes are devoid of truth, and how your lies have ruined the lives of generations. I will tell them all the ways you fool the world into thinking you don't exist, and how you remain blind to those without the burden of feeling your presence, without the burden of feeling you linger in memories, but I see you. I always have. In 10 weeks, I will tell them I wrote about you, and I would tell them what I would say to you the next time if I had the chance. And I will tell them that I hate you. No metaphor, no simile needed. I hate you. You haunt me, and I hate you for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for that amazing presentation and especially very powerful ending. I would like to invite questions for all three presenters. We have about half an hour. And you can ask me questions by raising your hand in, I already see raised hands, they're coming up here, or posing a question on chat. I'm going to start off with Sophia Rekaby, and followed by Isabel Levin, followed by Jordan Jackson, and then I'll check back to see who else is in the queue. Sophia?
Hey guys, I just want to say each of your presentations were absolutely stunning and amazing. You guys are doing amazing things and it's absolutely mind-blowing, like mind-blowing. So my question is for Bryant. I want to know what, like, your opinion on the appropriation of Black Lives Matter into Blue Lives Matter, focusing on cops, like the appropriation of that language, similar to how you describe the appropriation of the language around slavery to COVID.
Thank you so much for your question, Sophia. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so when like stealing language like that, like Blue Lives Matter, from Black Lives Matter, like personally for me, it's always really hard to see because it's one of those things where it's like, one, it's not even original. It's kind of like you're just basically stealing, you're stealing from a whole movement that's like actually experiencing something traumatic for your own like, how am I trying to say this? For your own like, I don't know, just so you can have deniability, and so just so you can't like address what's being said about you specifically. So that's like really painful. And also too, like we don't just see it with like Blue Lives Matter. It's now in terms of COVID, like Bar Lives Matter that's been going on too. Like I don't know if anyone has seen like that circulating around, but like I don't know, all these appropriations of language of a movement is just to have deniability and say like, no, there's nothing wrong here. We don't have to have that conversation. And I think that's basically just what it is. It's another one of way to avoid a very difficult conversation. So yeah, thanks.
Unmuting myself. Isabel, you're next. Your question.
Can you hear me? Okay, so I have a question for Eden and a question for Bryant. So for Eden, I'm wondering how, if at all, you think the pandemic has increased the need for nonprofits and specifically how that's influenced how they function, just like during this time. And for Bryant, first, I love the medium of photographs. And I'm wondering what's the like socio-political relevance of being photographed and almost being a spectacle, and how does that differ for Black protesters, white protesters, and the aims of the protest?
So thanks for your question, Isabel. Yes, the pandemic is definitely altered the way these organizations operate and also the ways they look for funding. So these organizations are very susceptible to economic changes because they mainly rely on donations from other people, private foundations, or the government. And most funding usually tends to shrink in times of economic downturn. And so in a country with a pretty weak social safety net, I think we've kind of all witnessed how with millions of people applying for unemployment, they are starting to really finding themselves relying on these services that these nonprofits are offering. And so in theory, these nonprofit organizations really would serve to correct the ills of capitalism by redistributing these resources. And they oftentimes rely mainly on labor from working class people as volunteers. And I think we've seen a lot of those people have found themselves in the demographic of people who now need assistance. And so these nonprofit organizations kind of find themselves in a bind where they have so many people to serve and not a whole lot of resources or people to help distribute them. And so I'm sure we've all seen the photographs of the enormous lines of people waiting in line at like local food banks and things like that. And it really puts pressure on these organizations. And unfortunately, a lot of small organizations in times like this can no longer function or sustain themselves. And we've also seen a lot of pictures of like farmers like just dumping gallons of milk and getting rid of tons of crops that they can't sell. And so I think that offers a pretty ironic commentary on the state of the economy that we're in, but also how these organizations can't really fill in the gaps of the government in all the ways we need them to when we find ourselves in times like these.
Thank you so much for your question, Isabel. I didn't get the first part of your question down, but I remember you asking about like how's being photographed different between like white protesters versus Black protesters. And there is a huge difference in terms of like who can feel comfortable showing up to a movement and having their face fully shown and protest. And I think we see that a lot in terms of like the Black Lives Matter protests that are going on, where protesters literally cannot show their face because police are hunting them and looking for them and trying to like take them and capture them. Well, as these white protesters who are protesting in the middle of a pandemic with like purposefully trying to like say this, it doesn't exist, can do so with guns, with weapons, and show their face and to storm in Capitol buildings and not be harmed in any way or not be seen as threatening. And I think photographs kind of like really show that, like who gets to show their face, who can't show their face. And that's also really historical as well, because if we go back to like lynchings and public lynchings, like no one ever tried to hide their face. White people never tried to hide their face or to cover their identities because they wanted to be seen, and because they didn't have to worry about being seen or being caught and facing consequences as that. So yes, there's difference. Thanks.
So I just realized that there was an early question asked of Vicky from Angela Reyes that I wanted to ask you now, Vicky, and then we will follow that with a question from Jordan Jackson, followed by a question from Ariel that's on chat, and then we'll come back to you, Alex. Vicky, the question is, first, excellent presentation. Angela says, I like how you're teasing apart explicit denotation, what you're calling conventional implicature, and implicit indexicality, what you're calling conversational implicature, and focusing on pronouns to see how groups and group boundedness are created. You're finding that Asian Americans are participants as well in racializing discourses through subtle linguistic work is profound. My question is, have you seen the opposite, that is, any firmly anti-racist posts that call out this racism? And if so, what linguistic cues do they use? Great question.
Thank you, Professor Reyes, for this question. The results for this part actually appear in the theme that I don't touch upon in my presentation, which is comments that address the naming directly. So in that section, there are comments that openly say that these terms are racist, and they contribute to division in the country and anti-Asian or anti-Chinese sentiments. In this case, the implicature would be like that there's no coded language, where there's the conventional and conversational picture are one and the same. But in the side of supporting certain ethnicities, by saying directly that certain parts of this discourse is racist, and that we as a community, in this case, that we would be considering the group that considers Asian American as its own community, should be supporting other Asians regardless of differences in ethnicities between Asians. So in that case, the results for that section would be an example of people who are presenting completely anti-racist opinions that are just openly refusing to use any of these terms because of its acknowledgement that this propagates racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. Jordan Jackson, you have a question.
Hi there, amazing presentations, everyone. My question rather is for Eden, and I was thinking about separation of church and state, among other things, during your presentation, and I wanted to know how it's constitutional and legal for the U.S. government to fund these faith-based organizations. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for your question, because that's a really good question. So this goes back to George Bush. In 2001, he signed an executive order that created the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiative. And what this did was it created 13 different centers and different federal agencies. And the goal of this initiative was to uplift and make the process more streamlined, a little bit, basically level the playing field for secular organizations and faith-based organizations to apply for grants from the government. And so I'm sure, as you implied, a lot of people questioned the constitutionality of this action, and it was subsequently sued, and it made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And so in Hine v. Freedom from Religious Foundation, it was ruled on in 2007. The Supreme Court actually upheld the constitutionality of this program on the basis that taxpayers cannot sue the executive branch when it comes to executive programs that are funded from the executive budget. And so I think we can kind of see clearly how that has set precedent for a number of cases in following years. And most recently, like 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court ruled on a case from Montana about the state giving school vouchers for private schools, and the the question at hand was sort of like, is it constitutional for them to exclude religious private schools? And the Supreme Court held that it was unconstitutional. And so I think since then we've kind of seen this more, maybe the shift away from, the wall of between church and the government, and sort of more to like, there needs to be an equal playing field for all of these institutions. So it's a really good question.
Thank you, Eden. I have a question from Ariel Coleman for Bryant and Vicky that are actually both historically kind of contextualized. Bryant, the question for you is, historically, how has false witnessing affected the stereotypes of Black Americans? How is false witnessing stimulated by white fear? And Vicky, historically, when did xenophobia against Chinese immigrants and or Chinese Americans begin in America?
Thank you for your question, Ariel. So in terms of how false witnessing has affected like Black Americans and like, well, I find that like in the creation of these narratives, people will often draw on the stereotypes of the Black identity to like create these narratives, to enact violence specifically against like Black community members. So I think a recent example of this would be, and I can never remember names, that's a flaw of mine, but the woman who lied in Central Park and said that this Black man was harassing her, and she put on this whole like, it's a Black man, he's hurting me, type of voice. And she drew on the racialized context of like stereotypes of what it means to be a Black man and what society thinks of Black men being violent and aggressive toward her, to create that false narrative and to false witness to something that wasn't true, that could have actually killed him and put him in a very, very horrible situation. So Amy Cooper, yes, thank you, Professor Buford. So I think that's one way, and that's also historical of like lies being told to justify violence against the Black community, and that's also based in white fear of Black people and Black identity.
So thank you, Ariel, for your question. And it's a really loaded question that comes with a lot of history, but I'll give you the shortened version of it. So it began with Chinese immigration into the US with the American dream that we're going to come here, we're going to make a lot of money, we're going to be successful because of job opportunities. And at that point, the American mindset was also basically that these incoming immigrants are a source of cheap labor. We can take advantage of them to build railroads. We can use them as people who don't understand like the money system, so we can pay them at lower rates and they'll take it because they have to have a job in this country. And at that point, the model minority myth was already forming, where Asians or Chinese were viewed as minorities who won't fight back. They'll take any job, they'll do anything, but because of the language barrier and because of their phenotype, they're seen as not part of the society. They can't participate in politics and they can't represent themselves in the government. So they're minorities that we can take advantage of. But despite that model minority myth, at the time, the Asian immigrants were also gaining financial leverage. They're becoming more successful because of the jobs they were willing to take. And that began to be perceived as a threat in American society, where the idea of the immigrants are taking our jobs came up. And then there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was in 1882, I believe. You can fact check me on that, where it's the first instance of American government refusing to take a specific ethnicity, or the Chinese specifically in this case, closing the gates for that immigrant group, which would be like the case of xenophobia, or in this case, sinophobia, which is a fear of the Chinese specifically. And this, yes, thank you, Sophia. It is 1882. And this mindset of seeing the Asians as model in the fact that they are quiet, they are silent, they won't speak back, but at the same time, they're not a part of this society because they can't participate in politics, continues into the current times with COVID, where that mindset is still a framework for how people are perceiving the Asian American community.
Thank you, Vicky. Alex, you have a question, Alex 1.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to start by saying to the presenters that you each did a really incredible job, and I learned so much from each of your presentations. And my question is for Vicky. So I was wondering about your opinion of Reddit sort of during, before, and post your research, and if or how it changed.
Thank you, Alex. To be honest, I didn't have much exposure to Reddit before this project, where I actually had to. The reason why I put in the slide that explains the system of Reddit is because I myself did not know what the system of Reddit was. Though I didn't have much of an opinion about the platform, but I only knew that it's a place where people really give their, in the nicest terms, the frankest of opinions, where it can get very controversial because people are really honest with what they say. After doing this research, I think the subreddit that I'm looking at, the Asian American subreddit, is particular in that it's not a representation of Reddit itself, where there are subreddits that are dedicated towards racism or controversial topics, and it's a bit different in the Asian American group because the moderators have their statement that say if there are statements that are blatantly racist or offensive, without consideration, they're going to be removed. So I think my perception of Reddit itself is a bit skewed because I've only looked at this single subreddit, but in my thoughts right now, I see it as a place where people can go to keep record of their experiences, and at the same time there is representation of some more controversial opinions, but also like an overwhelmingly supportive representation of perceptions that people have about racism, where a lot of the people on Reddit are slamming down on racism, which might be because of the age group. It's a social media platform. It represents a younger generation of Asian Americans, so that might contribute to the reason why it seems to be a lot more going towards like equality type answers. But that's the perception of Reddit that I have right now.
On chat, there are 2 questions. One is for Eden, which was a question from Ariel that I had missed. So the question, Eden, is can NGOs and nonprofit organizations be categorized interchangeably?
So the answer is yes and no. It kind of depends what you're talking about and how you're referring to them. So within the US, when nonprofits and NGOs fill out their IRS forms, they both receive 501c3 status. And so for the purpose of like this data set that I used, we reached out to all of these organizations based off of their IRS forms. And so, you technically wouldn't know if they're nonprofits or NGOs because like, I don't know if they have government affiliation or not. And it is true that nonprofits also can work internationally, but the real difference comes between with the composition of their board and members is that non-governmental organizations are categorized the way that they are because they don't have affiliation with the government, and that heavily impacts the way that they're perceived by the people that they serve. Although they can receive government funding, they cannot have government members on their board or any executives like that. And so I think they largely pride themselves on the fact that they're separate entities, whereas the same cannot be said for nonprofits, or not all nonprofits.
Thank you, Eden. We have a hand raised. Jalen, you have a question?
Yes, hi. My question is for Vicky. So I saw that you used Python and Reddit's API. Sorry, I'm gonna geek out about this for a minute. So I just want to know about your experience with that code, and how was that using that sort of very technical aspect in your research? Like how did that play a role in your interpretation? So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jalen, for your question that I kind of expected to come from you, especially because this is a very tech part of the study that was completely unfamiliar territory for me. I spoke to UNC's wonderful librarians who taught me how to use Python. And my impression of the Reddit API is that for beginners, it's pretty easy to use. I have no knowledge of coding, but the system is available on the internet with instruction manuals and explanations of how to use it. So it was pretty easy to self-learn. In the case of how I'm using it, I just needed it to rank posts for me and gather the data of how it's ranked so that I don't have to scroll through Reddit itself and search for the posts. It searches the post for me and makes a list. And that was really useful in cases of gathering data, of actually analyzing the data. I went for a more qualitative method, which is why I didn't have to have Reddit do that for me. So because searching actual terms inside the comments would be pretty difficult, but searching hit keywords from the post titles is pretty easy. And it gives you links to the certain posts, and it gives you all the statistical information, like scores and the upvote percentages, and the information about the users who have posted the posts. So in the case of this study, I would say that it served its purpose well, and it was pretty easy to learn.
Thank you, Vicky. There's a question for Brian from Maria Duran. First, she says, wonderful presentation. I especially appreciated the creative element of your project. My question is, did your research yield any conclusions about how gender plays a role in the performance of white supremacy? I noticed that both of the protesters holding up signs about enslavement were white women, and I wonder if there's an implicit argument about white feminism there.
Thank you so much for your compliments and your question. So yes, there is, I dive a little bit deeper into that in militarization category, because I did notice that all the photographs that I were seeing was white men in the role that like masculinity and like this attempt to basically like remasculize, how am I trying to say this? Like the country came about within these protests and like how that's perceived through these images and these photographs. But I did notice that in some of my readings, it talked about how the United States itself will like go through periods of masculation and femininity, and how those are usually decided based on like how they perform in war, because the United States is just, it's such a war culture. And so in thinking about COVID as this war against this virus, the United States is going through this period of femininity, quote unquote, based on these theories. And so in these photographs, it can be seen as like, first, white supremacists, and white supremacy itself is also very patriarchal and it's very sexist. And so they have like their own set of like, we also have to be men and we also have to present this way, and you can't take our rights away because we're men. And so that's appearing here through these photographs of like militarization. That's an attempt to show off their masculinity and precisely performing their white supremacy in this sense. But I did notice that like the women were the ones with these signs that were claiming like this is enslavement, and then it was the white men that were holding up their guns and trying to strike fear. There's completely different emotions that get evoked when looking at these photographs. But yes, I did notice something. Hopefully that answered like a little bit of your question. I'm still trying to like think through those, but there's gendered analysis there. Yeah.
I'm gonna, there's a question for Eden, but before that, I'm going, because it's my question, I have a question that I want to add, Brian, to ask your opinion because of Maria's question, whether you have seen, it's that image of the Portland protester, right, who's naked, have you seen that
No, I
image?
haven't.
It's a naked woman who at 2 a.m. did naked yoga in front of armed, officers who shot pepper bullets at her feet. And she was wearing a beanie because, and then this white guy protected her. And that might be, I think that's when you get a chance, take a look at, because my question was going to be about that, if you had seen that and what that might also say about femininity, because I was thinking what would have happened if she was, it took place at 2 a.m., I think. Like, what if she was Black and being out there naked? Would it have been pepper bullets? Would it have been real bullets? And also kind of intersecting that with COVID and thinking, like, to be able to be naked on a public place, especially a street, and like, anyway, all of those thoughts. But I think that question about whether there is whiteness and femininity, and even acts of solidarity, how it always relies on a kind of white supremacist, the privileges of a white supremacist framework, right? And the performance of it. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. The last part of even how solidarity depends on the privileges of white supremacy.
That's a really good question. How solidarity depends on the privileges of white supremacy. Can I have a little more time to think on that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And in the meantime, I will ask two questions of Eden. One is from Sophia and the other one is from Dr. Una. Sophia asks, what are your opinions on the different types of philanthropy? Which do you dislike the most? And what do you think the future is for NGOs and other nonprofits? So that's from Sophia. And then Dr. Una asks, what variables would you introduce to make the measure of organizational size more precise?
So thank you both for those questions. They're both really good. I'll answer Sophia's first. And so this is a very nuanced question, and I've been thinking it through for a while. And so I think personally, I'll have to go with social reform. I think that is the most impactful. However, I think that it's the most impactful when it's coupled with something else. Maybe it's relief or maybe it's improvement. Because you do recognize that, like, these organizations see an issue and that they strive to address that issue. And not all the time can those issues wait. And social reform is a more long investment. And so sometimes, like, immediate relief is necessary. But I also think, like, conversely, like, there's some organizations that, like, just work from, like, improvement. And so, like, for example, like, organizations that, like, teach people how to build wells, you know, they're helping these people, but, like, it's not solving the problem of why they don't have clean water in the first place. And so I think social reform with the mixture of some of the other ones, but, like, on the other hand, it's like a lot of these organizations can't really work from social reform because they may risk getting expelled from the countries they work in. And they also, I think in the example I provided, like, they also risk not being funded by people who don't support what they're trying to do. And so I think that for organizations that are really challenging the status quo and trying to get something done with social reform, it can be kind of a double-edged sword, unfortunately. And I think also this really kind of relies on the size of the organization because it requires a lot more resources to work for multiple different traditions of philanthropy. And so, yeah, those are my thoughts on that. And to answer Dr. Una's question, I think that the measures of organizational size I used were pretty good. But I think that if I had to add in some more variables, it might be something like asking these organizations how long they've been organizations. Also, if, like, you're familiar with, like, big organizations like United Way, asking them how many satellites they have, because that's an organization that operates with multiple offices around the country and oftentimes multiple in one state. And then I also might add how big is the general population that they serve or their general client base to kind of get an idea of, you know, how many services are they providing to people and how many people are really relying on these organizations.
Thank you, Eden. We have 1 minute left. Brian, if you had a response, I don't want to put you on the spot. So because I asked you a question, I broke the cardinal sin, but also the most academic faculty performance to ask a question about something that you haven't seen, about a framework you have not thought about. But if you have thoughts, or any of the panelists of any of this, like what does it mean to be, like how do we rely on existing structures to create allyships that then reproduce some of the very structures that we're trying to break down? So if any of you have thoughts on that as your closing comments, please feel free.
Okay. So the question being, how do we create allyships relying on the same structures? That's a really tough question that I have to be 100% honest about. It's going to take a lot more thought for me to like give a solid answer. Yeah.
I guess my question is, I think we tend to reproduce those kind of structures of injustice even when we are trying to perform allyship for different reasons, right? Because we rely on the existing structures. So part of Care and Crisis kind of is trying to rethink some of these structures, whether it's from a larger NGO perspective, if it's our own kind of internalized, colonized kind of selves, right? Or how we respond, or whether it's in support of movements like Black Lives Matter, or these kinds of white supremacist ideas, is how we subconsciously or maybe unintentionally reproduce some of those structures. We are 1 minute over our allocated time, and I would like to thank all three of you for spectacular presentations, for brilliant responses to questions. That was truly amazing, and it was a privilege to chair this panel, so thank you. I will hand it over to Dr. Gwen now to wrap up this morning's session. Thank you all.
Outstanding presentations, and thank you for moderating, Dr. Silva. In the chat box, you can see that our last session today and of the conference is our MURAP alumni panel and reunion. We have some panelists that will give brief remarks at the beginning, but it'll be a free-for-all and open to having people join us and talking about their experiences in MURAP and what happened after MURAP, their journey. So make sure that you register if you haven't registered yet, so you can get the proper link. And also just a reminder that all of our cameras will be on. So we'll see you back here at 2. Thank you.